Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Key Takeaways from COP26. My name is Chris Robinson, Research Director here at Lux Research, and I'll be moderating today's session. I'll be presenting today alongside my colleagues Josh Haslam, Research Director, Anthony Schiavo, Research Director, and Arvind Burkle, Vice President and Group Director here at Lux Research. Throughout the webinar, you can type any questions you have in the questions box on your screen. Time permitting, we'll answer all of the questions that we can. If your question does not get answered, please do not hesitate to email to questions@luxresearchinc.com, and we'll make sure to respond. So like you, we've been reading a lot about the Glasgow Climate Pact, discussing the impacts of a lot of the broader announcements that happened at COP26 over the last few weeks, and really thinking about what impact does this have on corporate innovation teams. And I think the underlying message here is that corporate sustainability really isn't any longer a buzzword. I think we really saw that shift at the Paris Agreement, where companies are now really realigning their core business to focus on sustainability, reduce emissions, embrace the circular economy. And that was kind of the landscape and the landscape that was set going into these COP26 discussions. So today we want to highlight some of the key takeaways from COP26 and what this means for corporate sustainability teams. So let's jump right in. Now, an important kind of context for these discussions was the IPCC report that was released this summer, detailing that humans are responsible for roughly 1.1 degrees Celsius of global temperature rise thus far. We've already started to see the impacts of climate change, whether it's increasing frequency of extreme weather events, an intensification of the water cycle, which has caused more intense rainfalls, flooding, and droughts. And ultimately, this has resulted in changes in plant and wildlife ecosystems. And there is growing recognition of the challenges that these pose, and a greater need to recognize that urgent action is needed to prevent some of the worst effects of climate change. And really meeting some of the goals that were set in the Paris Agreement about really limiting the impacts of climate change and adapting our environment to climate change, it requires global cooperation. If we don't have a global framework for agreeing about how to reduce emissions, we'll enter a period where countries are using emissions laws to make them as lax as possible to attract industry, and a competition over really allowing companies to emit in their industries. So these types of global frameworks are really important for addressing climate change on a global scale. And that is why the Paris Agreement was so important. It laid the groundwork for how countries will work together to both mitigate emissions and adapt our environment to climate change. And so heading into COP26, this was really billed as a landmark event and another opportunity to discuss some of the details and operationalize some of the parts of the Paris Agreement. So some of the key details going into the event we were looking for were, how are countries updating their nationally determined contributions, which are the plans that they've put in place in order to, make sure they're meeting their obligations as part of the Paris Agreement. Climate financing was a big topic. There is recognition that wealthier developed countries are responsible for a bulk of historical emissions, but some of less developed countries are the ones kind of bearing the initial brunt of the impacts of climate change today. So there's recognition funding needs to flow from some of these developed nations to developing nations. And some of the key details were on the agenda to be discussed about how that would work, as well as carbon offsetting mechanisms. So recognition that really global emissions reduction may be accelerated by being able to trade carbon offsetting emissions. So if countries are ahead of their plan and their responsibilities in the Paris Agreement, countries struggling to meet theirs can use carbon offsets. And there were slated to be more details ironed out about exactly how those mechanisms would work. So now I think we can start jumping into really what happened at COP26. And now I'd like to invite my colleague, Dr. Arvind Burkle, to discuss with us here. So kind of with that context in mind, what were some of the key announcements that were made at COP26 and in the Glasgow Climate Pact?
Yes, thank you, Chris. And like you said, we've been really watching COP26 and also really anticipating COP26. I remember being at the Berlin Energy Transition Dialogue earlier this year in March, where Um, uh, the US and the EU and also the UK were already announcing big plans and changes to their nationally defined contributions leading up to COP26. So they were really pushing for a higher ambition level. And so the question is, did they succeed? And I think they did, because one of the biggest things in my mind that came out of COP26 is the unambiguous recognition of the 1.5 degree target. Now, not a lot of people are talking a lot about that, but if you remember, the Paris Agreement still mentioned we should try and limit global warming to 2 degrees. And by the way, 1.5 degrees would be even better. So that ambiguity has now been dissolved, and it's just 1.5 degrees. That's immensely important for industry because it gives a very clear direction, and also already a very clear direction as to how all those other NDCs are going to change in the coming probably 2 years. It also gives a very firm footing, and we'll get to that in a moment, I think, for the CCS industry. So getting to 1.5 degrees will require carbon capture. Carbon capture is very much on the menu. A couple of other things. Yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I think from my perspective as well, I think the acceleration is really the key takeaway as well. Even things like kind of moving some of the goalposts for carbon reduction, so to speak. So, the 45% reduction in global emissions that was called by 2030 is compared to 2010 levels. So it's a little bit more stringent than in the past as well.
Yeah, indeed. Now, the other thing really is about the financing. So there's acceleration, but I think we also see more specific goals now and more specific agreements on financing. A lot of the help for poorer countries is now redirected towards adaptation, and I think that is really important. But at the same time, we now have not really a complete picture, but the first outline of the so-called Sustainable Development Mechanism. And the Sustainable Development Mechanism is supposed to replace the two mechanisms that were in the Kyoto Protocol, which is the Joint Implementation Mechanism and the Clean Development Mechanism. Now, the mechanism isn't fully baked yet, but it's really encouraging to see that there are some initial agreements coming out of COP26 now, so that international collaboration to reduce greenhouse gas emissions can really start to take shape now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that was one area where, especially for the least developed countries, that they wish to see a little bit stronger language was around climate financing. I think there's some positives that, yes, more of that funding is going toward adaptation. More of that funding is, intended to go in the form of grants instead of loans. But I think the least developed countries would have liked to see, a little bit stronger language around that.
Yeah, that's always the case, isn't it? So we still need to define a win-win, and it's really interesting to start looking at the new NDCs as they are coming. A good example would be to look at Japan. Japan effectively needs to decarbonize the world in order to decarbonize itself, because nearly all of Japan's energy is imported. So as long as that energy is not decarbonized, then Japan is dealing in terms of country with a huge amount of Scope 3 emissions. So really looking at those, Japan, South Korea, and a couple of other NDCs to see how that international collaboration will take shape is going to be really interesting in the coming 18 months.
So I think, kind of broadly reflecting a greater emphasis on climate finance and funding for less developed countries, an acceleration of some of the timelines. I think those are really two of the big takeaways from COP26. But one of the questions that really we've been fielding from our clients is kind of, what does this event mean for me and my organization? Obviously, if you read the Glasgow Climate Pact, it doesn't talk about specific industries, even if it gets pretty close to calling out the energy industry. but the reality is there are a lot of sectors, and really all sectors of the global economy, which are going to feel the ripple effects of some of the agreements and some of the policies that will come out of COP26 that we might see implemented in future nationally determined contributions. So now I want to basically walk through three industries that we think will be impacted: the energy sector, chemicals and materials companies, and then consumer packaged goods companies as well. So Ari, I'll invite you once again to start our discussion, still focused on the energy space. And the energy sector is one that is always really kind of front and center at any kind of global climate conversations. So, to kick things off, maybe a question to you would be, if you were an executive in the oil and gas space, how are you feeling coming out of COP26 today?
Right. Now, I would have mixed feelings. There's a sense of relief, I think. And the sense of relief is there because the energy industry, if anything, needs extremely clear guidance. It needs to know what policy is all about up until 2050. And it needs to know that it's going to stay more or less that way, that the governments of the world are going to stay that course. And I think that is a clear outcome of COP26. If anything, the line, the roadmap, the ambitions for net zero and for the 1.5 degrees have been confirmed, and if anything, are firmer than ever. Of course, having said that, the reason they need that really clear policy and that really steady policy line, of course, is because their products are going to be completely different. If you're an oil and gas company, effectively, you're looking at the complete abolition of your products over time. So they will need to do a lot of investments. And I think in that sense, we also saw some clear timelines occurring now. So for example, we saw an agreement, not by all countries participating, but by many of them, to introduce electric vehicles and to phase out the use of internal combustion engines. So in terms of the oil and gas industry, effectively, we saw a timeline, an agreed upon timeline, to no longer use gasoline or diesel. And that timeline is by 2040, which means that this more or less now confirms all of the projections that we've seen, that are all seems to converge towards the idea that there's a peak in oil demand around 2035. I'd say that is basically the outcome of COP26, that timeline has been confirmed, and that is now what all of these industries have to work with. So think about your E&P activities. Do you still want to invest in E&P? Because now you know until when roughly you have to continue to increase your oil production. What about your refineries? Do you want to do the same thing that Phillips 66 did and convert some of those refineries to maybe biofuels or even to synthetic fuels, maybe explicitly to serve aviation and shipping? So those are the kind of questions that are now on the table, and that COP26, I think, provided a reasonably clear context. You never get it handed on a silver platter and completely solid, but it's not a bad outcome in that sense. It's reasonably good guidance for the industry.
Yeah, I agree. I think if I was an executive, I'd be first. In recognition of all of the same trends we've probably been talking about are still true, but we probably need to move faster. And I think the other thing worth recognizing is really important around the electric vehicle space. A lot of oil and gas companies, I think, like to claim, we're very diversified, we make lots of different products, but the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic showed they're incredibly reliant on liquid fuels for transportation. And without it, their business model really does start to fall apart. So we touched on electric vehicles a little bit. The other question I have for you, really from a technology lens, do you think anything kind of coming out of COP26, are there specific technologies that maybe received, kind of a boost on their outlook, or similarly, their outlook is maybe somewhat poorer after the event?
So the clear winner, I think, in terms of technology, if you can talk about a winner, is carbon capture and storage. I think with the recognition of the 1.5 degrees, with the acceleration, it is now a given that we will need to have carbon capture and storage. And hopefully also carbon utilization, which of course is the better option. At least it's a bit more productive than just storage. So I think that's really something to watch. The other thing to watch, I think, is industrial heat and an acceleration in finding alternatives for industrial heat. This is, we don't talk about that very often, but I think we'll see a really big push for that in the near future. Why? Because it's if you find reasonable solutions to provide decarbonized heat to industry, it is the low-hanging fruit. It's the thing you can do almost tomorrow, not quite tomorrow, in 2 years. So that is way easier than much bigger shifts, like trying to make all of your polymers out of CO2 in the future. That is probably also going to happen, but that will take at least 15 years to really implement. But the industry can start decarbonizing as of tomorrow. And the one way to do it is to look at heat.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Ari. We'll now shift gears a little bit and start talking about the chemicals and materials sector. So I'll invite my colleague Anthony Schiavo to join us here. Now, I mentioned energy companies and the energy sector is usually, front and center of climate discussions, but I think this year there was a bit more discussions around, heavy industry. So, Anthony, maybe I'll ask you the same question to start off. If you're an executive in the chemicals and the materials space, how are you feeling coming out of COP26?
Thanks, Chris. I think I'm feeling a little different if I'm in the chemical space versus the material space. The chemicals industry was really not a focus at COP26 this year. But like you said, there was a much stronger focus on other types of materials. So I think for the chemicals industry, the big sort of hits were the methane pledge. A lot of chemical companies are relying on natural gas. I think they're going to have to get a lot more serious about their Scope 3 emissions and sourcing less emissions intense types of feedstocks. And the focus on hydrogen, which will benefit the chemicals industry affects their attempts to decarbonize over the next decade. But the industries that really were in the spotlight were steel and concrete. I think I'm feeling pretty good, hopefully, if I'm a steel CEO, because I've gotten some guidance that there really are going to be clear markets and clear incentives for steel decarbonization. But at the same time, there's not a lot of very near-term opportunities to decarbonize steel. You can shift from maybe a primary production to more remelting, but the really big opportunities for decarbonization, like hydrogen-based reduction of iron, are still in the early R&D stages. So there's a lot of risk there from a technology standpoint. So clearer signals, but also, a big challenge ahead.
Yeah, and I think that focusing on decarbonization of steel and cement is a really positive outlook for the hydrogen economy. The answer I thought maybe I would have given in the last section on energy. Really seeing industry as emerge as a driver of hydrogen. So maybe the same question I initially posed to Ari as well. From a technology focus, if you look at it through a technology lens, do you think, maybe aside from steel and cement, are there any technologies which you thought, really saw their outlook dramatically improved or otherwise during COP26?
I think the biggest winners were in steel and cement. Certainly, for cement, it's been a bit different than in steel. I think in steel, you've seen a lot of collective action on decarbonization and particularly hydrogen-based technologies there. But for cement, I think there's been a lot of open questions still about what the future of that decarbonization approach is. What we saw during COP26 was a pretty substantial commitment towards purchasing from world governments, Canada, a handful of others. And those governments make up in cement purchasing, 20%, maybe 40% of the market. in their nations because they're building roads and bridges and infrastructure. So you saw a really huge signal from the market there that cement decarbonization is going to have a clear market and a clear opportunity, as well as sort of an advantage in terms of price and sort of profitability. So I think those cement technologies are definitely the big winners. A bit more broadly, there's a lot of related and supporting technologies underneath hydrogen. I think there's a lot of interesting opportunities in hydrogen storage for advanced materials, composites, some opportunities even around coatings as you try and retrofit that infrastructure from natural gas to hydrogen. So there are some pretty interesting, I would say, tier 2 opportunities to support this big transition. There's going to be a lot of materials development needed. And I think a lot of those companies and innovators got a pretty substantial boost from COP26, and they're just a very strong support for these technologies.
Yeah, I think especially looking at steel and cement, cement in particular, it's interesting to see, governments also use their position as essentially a customer, not just someone kind of introducing legislation and regulations that companies have to meet, but actually flexing its muscle as a customer and saying, this is what we will be procuring, and kind of preparing the industry, saying, start building out that capacity to do this because we want it. That is a really strong market signal.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is that they're even going further, going further than that. I think the biggest impacts that we saw were not from regulation or from carbon prices or some of the more traditional, government measures, but from things like purchasing and also tariffs in the steel space as well. There was an US EU announcement sort of for free trade. They dropped some of the existing tariffs from the Trump era, but also they've signaled that there are going to be green steel sort of provisions worked into future tariffs. So that, I think, really shows that the sort of traditional regulatory tools are being a little bit underutilized, but there are a lot of other ways that governments are impacting the markets, and those are really positioned to be very impactful and powerful.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Anthony. We'll now move on to the last segment, looking at consumer and packaged goods. So, Josh, I'll pose the same question. You're an exec, at a CPG company. Maybe you feel a little bit more distant than even chemical and materials to some of the conversations at COP26. So, are you paying attention to the events? And if so, how are you feeling coming out of it?
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell all our clients, I hope you are paying attention to the event. I think it is important to some degree. And I think the first thing is, when I listen to this, we've heard, hey, 1.5 is a number, and and it's good to have that number. Is 1.5 really realistic? Based upon our previous experience with how governments move and how we're able to harmonize standards and policies. Honestly, I'm going to say no to that. I think we're probably much more likely to say somewhere between 1.5 and 2.0, and that's also fine. What does that mean? That means that how we produce food is still going to be experiencing uncertainty moving forward as climate changes continue, right? So there's lots of need for technologies moving forward that are going to protect the resilience of our food system. And agriculture, let's be clear, is already experiencing challenges. So if I'm a company, I'm doing my best to continue to protect the resilience, continue to protect my sourcing, my value chains, and I think that's really important. And I mean, for anybody who wants to know more about kind of what happened behind the scenes, because I think the goal of COP26 is much more around scope 1, scope 2 things rather than sort of scope 3 overall. So if you're interested in that, there's the Core Nevia roadmap that I think at least lets you understand what's happening behind the scenes, some of the things that maybe weren't quite as high profile, but you get a good idea of what's happening in some of the discussions that maybe weren't quite as high level for there. So that's the first thing. And the second thing I would say here then is, what does all that mean coming from there? I think we're going to see countries indeed connect greenhouse gas initiatives to the food system. And from this COP26, probably going to be two ways. First, I've heard the global methane pledge already come up, and that's definitely number one. It's going to affect livestock. It's going to affect rice. Those are the two big things. And we do see, a lot of innovations already happening in that, but those are two areas likely to experience continued innovation, in livestock, expect things around, feed and perhaps technologies to mitigate and monitor those emissions. And then, on the rice sector, we actually do see some innovations happening there, moving away from paddy-based systems to more of these direct seed type systems. And we'll expect to see, I think, that continue to emerge and move forward. The second part of this is forest preservation. And, I think we're already beginning to see a lot of moves there. The EU is putting forth a deforestation initiative, and that's out for public comment, coming straight off COP26. So I do think, COP26 is absolutely, affecting this to some degree. And, beyond that, actually, I was just at the Asia Pacific Agri-Food Summit, and, to hear there where deforestation, is mainly an issue around the world in a lot of emerging nations, and that being a major area for that, we see, a lot of companies, a lot of countries making additional policies in this. So do expect that to move forward as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, leading up to the event, if I was kind of an exec in that space as well, I was probably already thinking a lot about the energy industry. I've often told clients, really energy is kind of connected to all sectors. And I think if you're a food company, you're very aware of, rising natural gas prices. There's been issues with fertilizer production that arose from that. So that was probably good motivation to pay attention to the event as well.
Yeah, and I do think, beyond that, we're seeing, continue to just a much more integrated world when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions, right, and all sorts of industries. And I think more and more food sector has begun to take, more of a role in that. Now, there was also a lot of propaganda at COP26, at least behind the scenes, not necessarily around the discussions, but we had plant-based, being thrown at COP26 really hard from the food sector, and sort of an overall, I can say, demonization of livestock production. Is that the reality? No, there's lots of ways that both of those can both be, on the positive or negative end of their scales. And so I think that's also important for companies to understand, and companies to be thinking about for their technologies. Like, as I go into these and look for partners, do those partners, in reality align with what COP26 is outlining, and towards those goals, so that I can align with where governments are likely going to move in the future.
Mm-hmm. And so last question, kind of similar. You referenced, plant-based meat alternatives. Do you think there are any other technologies that saw, similarly a boost or, a negative outlook after COP26?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I said before, anything around methane is going to be important. So precision livestock farming is going to have a continued boom. Anything that, I expect the APAC region to actually see a lot of innovation in the space. I think overall, while we saw, countries like India maybe pulling back a little from some of those early commitments that were, or some of those early versions of the final Glasgow commitment there made, a lot of that was around trade, not necessarily around improving resilience of the food system. And a lot of those countries recognize that they need to be more independent, perhaps, right? So we already see independence, I think, being a major move. For instance, Singapore 30 by 30, producing 30% of its own food. And I expect we're going to see a lot more of that. So, expect technologies that enable countries to be more independent to be important. And plant-based goes into that, right? As well as things like, controlled environment agriculture. And as a result, COP26 does lend itself to innovation. I absolutely believe that now. But again, as I said, are changes going to happen super fast as far as how they affect the climate and overall the bulk of production? No. So, we're still going to have all those challenges, and then they're going to get a bit worse for a while, right? But, and as a result, that I think is still the key takeaway to remember, right? Just because this happened, don't think, okay, we're moving forward in a really easy direction. No, I mean, all the technologies out there that we need to make an impact are going to be absolutely critical still moving forward.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Josh. So maybe summarizing some of our thoughts around the event, really an important thing to watch for moving forward is really the updated NDCs from, countries around the world. That was part of the Glasgow Climate Pact that, really a strengthening of those NDCs and acceleration of the timelines for emissions reductions through 2030 needs to happen. And Glasgow itself wasn't a policy event, so to speak, but some of the agreement will lead to policy changes in the future, and those will show up in nationally determined contributions. Additionally, I think we have to recognize the energy sector is going to feel the impacts first. They directly talked about emissions, of course, from largely the oil and gas space, but really, as we discussed, every sector is going to feel this push for decarbonization, whether it's through a tie to the energy industry or through increased sustainability in its products. And lastly, I think if we look back and reflect on Paris as really the defining moment when sustainability stopped being a corporate buzzword and started being a more serious initiative, whereas we're now seeing companies launch their own net zero targets, but importantly today starting to take action by investing and partnering with companies that can reduce emissions. I think Glasgow might be remembered as something that really redefines the relationship between companies and governments as governments really start to ratchet up emissions related regulations. How do companies respond? Because the reality is not all sectors, not all companies will survive this shift. So now we'd like to open it up for any questions you may have. So as a reminder, please drop any questions in the questions box and we'll answer what we can. We do have a few coming in already, and I see one fairly broad question that I'll pose to everyone. We mostly talked about the impacts of what was announced, but curious, what are some of the biggest disappointments from the conference in your opinions?
Well, I think there's some pretty big headline disappointments. Obviously the weakening language on coal at the end was a big one, and that one got a lot of traction. I do think on some of the finance side, we saw some maybe overhyped announcements and not as much of a real commitment to leveraging finance to make change. And from my personal standpoint, recycling wasn't really talked about. And there is when you're talking about decarbonization, whether it's steel, whether it's in the chemicals, plastic space, there are real opportunities to decarbonize using the circular economy. I was generally grateful that those industries weren't focused at all, so I'll probably hold off my disappointment on that one, but maybe that's something we'll see at future COPs.
Yeah, coal was what first came to mind for me as well. Not seeing some of the more developed countries that are big consumers of coal sign on to the pledge to end coal, but definitely the softening of language as well. What about Ari or Josh? Was there anything else we should add to anything that was a disappointment at the conference?
I mean, I'll always push up that I think the food system should always be a major part of this, but I always understand as well that when we look at the big numbers, right, we got to deal with scope 1, scope 2 first, and I do think that that's critical. So I was disappointed that we didn't have more. At the same time, I think it's important to take care of those first, right, and remember that when we think about emissions and climate change, it does start with fossil fuels, and then we can deal with what's in the atmosphere after that, right? It's kind of one of those things of you have to use what molecules are there, and then you can deal with it from there. So that's, that is really important. And so I'm as I said, I'm going to reiterate before that this change is going to keep moving forward, and it won't move forward unless we do sequester a lot of the carbon that's already in the atmosphere, and that starts with not putting more in the atmosphere.
Yeah, for my part, in addition to what's been said, I think one thing to draw attention to here is the agreement to no longer invest in fossil projects. So there's an agreement between a number of countries to no longer invest in fossil energy projects abroad. so outside of the remit of that government. That's been celebrated as a breakthrough, and I think it is a breakthrough. At the same time, it is a weak breakthrough. It is not providing a clear guidance on what we want to do with oil exploration and production, or coal mining for that matter. So it was a bit disappointing in the sense that it would have been much stronger if there was a clear vision on how are we going to ramp down these industries. And it's really required that there is a coordinated ramp down. Just look at what's going on with the gas prices today. Countries need to talk about how they're ramping down oil and gas production over time. For the time being, they're actually ramping up, and they should probably be ramping up for a couple more years.
Excellent, thank you, everyone. Another question, this one might be more directed at Anthony. How can the cement industry really decarbonize? And is CO2 inherent to the product?
It is in a real sense. If you look at the chemical reactions, I think the opportunity is to capture that CO2 and use it again to make some sort of other product, whether it's an aggregate, whether it's an alternative to cement. I think some of the most promising approaches we're seeing are bolt-on type approaches where they're able to take that the gases from those reactions. They don't need to actually sequester the carbon or capture the carbon. They can just take those emissions and use them directly into some sort of other project, or into some sort of other material. The challenge, I think, will be scaling up from bolt-on solutions, which have a pretty clear place and a pretty clear role, to processes that are carbon neutral inherently. I think there's only so much you can do with bolt-ons, and it's important for the cement industry to have those bolt-on options, especially in the near term. But the challenge for me is not necessarily on the reactions of the chemistry. It's what do we do when we sort of reach the limit of bolt-ons. The other thing I would call out there is just reduction, better built environment design, right? If we are planning our built environment around higher density, if we're planning our built environment around less use of personal vehicles and reduced need for things like highways and parking, if we're building a ton of parking garages in all of our cities, that's a lot of concrete. That's going to make it more challenging, and it also it's linked in with all the other effects of fuel and other forms of emission, even road dust. So there are these technology solutions, but I think we also need to really think about what is our built environment, what built environment are we trying to create, and how does that built environment work as a system for overall decarbonization.
Yeah, thanks. And there are a couple questions kind of more about specific topics here. So one that came up is a question here that says nature-based solutions came up a lot during someone kind of reading about the conference. So does anyone have any thoughts on nature-based solutions?
Yeah, I'll jump in first at least. I think a couple things maybe that I didn't talk about outside of sort of deforestation and things that are happening there around sourcing. I do think what COP26 is going to lead the way for, as these numbers are set, are to some degree continued initiatives around sequestration of Scope 3 emissions, and there's already a number of initiatives ongoing to improve standardization of voluntary carbon markets to that end, and I do expect this to aid in creating an environment to continue that incentivization, right? And why do I say this? Well, one, if this deforestation bit pushes as hard as it is, and we indeed stop cutting down trees by 2030, right? It's actually a big deal, because when you look at the amount of land we have, then that means that's the amount of land we have to produce the food we have. So a major factor to consider is are we getting the most out of that land that we can, and is it as resilient as possible? And the only way to do that is to continue to improve it over time. And now sustainable agriculture in itself is about having land that can produce, and there's probably no farmer out there that doesn't want to pass its farm down a generation, but nonetheless you can indeed continue to improve the quality and value of their land. I remember not too long ago, actually, at a Global Ag Investing Summit, land is a pretty good return these days. If you have solid care of it, you can get 10% return year over year on that if you do it. And there's, it's amazing to see what the value of land can be, and let's say the Corn Belt of the U.S. It's amazing. So, I think we're going to see that push forward, and we're going to probably see it push forward through, financing investments. And I think, there are still some challenges. I keep bringing up emerging nations, but I do think it's critical. A lot of our food is produced by smallholders, and smallholders are inherently challenging to work with. And so, within that, technology is going to play a big role to connect the dots there, enable those people to access the resources that they need to monitor, mitigate, and connect to markets.
Josh, maybe this is more in the realm of science fiction, but if land is going to be such an issue or a constraint, does that change the equation on vertical farming and urban farming, these other types of?
The question's already, and the change is already happening. And we put out a CEA report not too long ago, and we think there is an opportunity there. I mean, CEA's controlled environment agriculture is growing steadily, and it's going to be. I mean, Anthony, you brought up, what does our urban environment look like? Well, one thing our urban environment likely looks like is a place to produce local food. And I brought up Singapore, a lot of these other nations that are beginning to develop programs to bring in the best minds in the world, bring in the best technologies of the world to begin to expand away from just leafy greens and herbs and things like this to all sorts of other opportunities in that, including, I mean, the big ones are the flowering plants, so the tomatoes, the strawberries, the things that are also highly nutrient dense, because not to deviate too far from COP26, but the world is still, we can produce a lot of calories. We just can't necessarily produce a lot of the nutrition we require. That's where we're limited, and a lot of these systems target crops that are nutrient dense, and that's critical moving forward. I mean, outside of this. Now, let's be clear, a lot of those systems are going to have challenges. So this is where one of those things about understanding integration, right? Understanding what's happening in the energy sector is very important, because all of a sudden having access to a lot of renewable energy sources makes those incredibly more attractive and less impactful. But the fact that they're also local, right? We're talking about decreasing shipping and logistics, which is one of the biggest issues with food around the world, right? It's where a big portion of that. I mean, if you compare a vertical ag group to a field ag group, and that vertical ag production system uses conventional energy and use all that, they're almost identical. And if not, the land production is much less impactful. And that's not even saying that they're not using other practices to do that. So you have to weigh that, and as these things happen, I think we are going to see those become very important. We are going to see, the potential for at least the outlying areas of urban environments to become a part of food production. Now, how diverse is that? We don't know, but I at this Asia Pacific Summit, I heard lots of companies saying, we're continuing to move forward. We're working on yield for all sorts of different crops. So it's exciting, and I do think, to Anthony's point, that materials and building materials are going to be absolutely critical to that. We got to bring down costs, but we also have to make those production systems scalable, and I think we're going to see that, to be honest.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Ari, Anthony, and Josh. I think that's about all we have time for today. As a reminder, if there are any questions we didn't get to, you can email us at questions@luxresearchinc.com. And I'd like to thank everyone for taking the time to join us today. Thank you.